The view from the 84th floor of the Blackwood Tower was worth $40 million. But tonight, the gravity was free. Julian Vane didn't scream when his polished loafers hit the slicked marble of the balcony edge. He didn't even fight the air. He simply tilted, eyes wide and glassy, as his weight betrayed him. Below him, Boston was a blur of amber lights. Above him, the only thing he saw was the doll-like face of his new maid, Laurie, peering over the railing with a look of mild, curious concern. To the authorities, it was a tragedy, a slip on a rain-slicked tile. To the tabloids, it was the high-rise heartbreak. But to Laurie, it was a masterpiece of physics. She hadn't laid a finger on him. She had spent the afternoon meticulously greasing the invisible tracks of the glass railing and waiting for the exact moment the wind gusted off the Atlantic. As Julian leaned out to take his nightly breath of ego, she leaned in and whispered the one secret he thought was buried with his first wife. The shock did more work than any shove could. Now, Julian is a headline, and Laurie is back in her quarters, smoothing her apron and checking her ledger. The collection has begun. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Who do you think sent her, or is she working for a much darker motive? With her innocently charming face, will she ever be caught? How do you feel about hearing domestic help after seeing what Laurie can do? If you want to see how this deadly game of cat and mouse ends, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a trophy in her collection. The wind off the Atlantic didn't just blow at the 84th floor of the Blackwood Tower. It shrieked, a primal force clawing at the floor-to-ceiling glass that separated Julian Vane from the rest of humanity. Inside, the penthouse was a vacuum of silence and expensive scents, sandalwood, aged scotch, and the faint, chemical bite of a fresh polish. Julian stood on the balcony, the city of Boston laid out beneath him like a carpet of crushed amber jewels. He felt invincible, the literal king of his domain, unaware that the very marble beneath his feet had been transformed into a death trap. Earlier that afternoon, while Julian was finalizing a merger that would ruin 1,000 lives, Laurie had been busy. With the quiet, rhythmic precision of a devoted servant, she had applied a specialized, high-grade lubricant to the invisible tracks of the glass railing and the foot-wide strip of marble bordering the edge. To the naked eye, it was merely a high-gloss shine. To the laws of physics, it was a frictionless path to the void. Laurie stepped out onto the balcony, her small frame nearly swallowed by the darkness, save for the crisp white of her maid's cap which caught the moonlight like a halo. She moved with a silent, eerie grace, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. Julian didn't turn around. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the night. He liked having her there, a quiet, beautiful shadow that catered to his whims without the burden of conversation. She looked like a girl who had never known a dark thought, a porcelain doll brought to life to serve the elite. The contrast was her greatest weapon, the biting cold of the wind versus the warmth of her deceptive smile. "It's a long way down, isn't it, Mr. Vane?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried perfectly over the gale. Julian chuckled, a dry, arrogant sound. "It's the only view worth having, Laurie. Most people spend their lives looking up. I prefer looking down." He leaned forward, resting his weight against the railing to get a better look at the shimmering harbor. Laurie moved closer, stopping just inches from his side. The air between them hummed with a tension Julian was too blinded by ego to sense. She leaned in, as if to share a conspiratorial thought, her face inches from his ear. The childlike innocence in her eyes vanished, replaced by a gaze as cold and vast as the ocean below. "Do you remember Sarah?" she whispered. The name acted like a physical blow. Julian's posture stiffened. Sarah was a ghost, a secret buried under layers of hush money and legal non-disclosure agreements from a decade ago. He turned his head sharply to look at the girl beside him, his eyes wide with a sudden, jarring terror. In that moment of shock, his equilibrium faltered. His polished loafers, designed for boardrooms rather than balconies, hit the treated marble and lost all pretense of grip. He reached for the railing, but his hands slid across the greased glass as if it were coated in ice. There was no friction to save him, no leverage to be found. He began to tilt, the center of his gravity shifting irrevocably toward the lights of Boston. Laurie didn't reach out to catch him. She didn't even flinch. She simply watched with a look of mild, clinical curiosity as the man who thought he owned the sky realized he was about to be reclaimed by the earth. "The timing," Laurie said softly, as his fingers finally lost their frantic scratch against the glass, "is the only thing that truly matters." Julian Vane didn't scream. The air was knocked out of him by the sheer impossibility of his situation. He vanished into the dark, a falling star stripped of its fire, leaving only the sound of the wind and the silhouette of a young woman in a lace cap. She stood at the edge for a long moment, her expression returning to one of calm, serene innocence. She wasn't a murderer in her own mind. She was a collector, and Julian was simply the latest piece to be filed away. She turned back toward the warmth of the penthouse, the physics of her secret safe in the shadows, ready to transform back into the terrified witness the world expected her to be. The silence that followed Julian Vane's departure was absolute, save for the hollow whistle of the wind through the open balcony doors. Laurie stood at the edge for exactly 10 seconds, her pulse a rhythmic, steady march that betrayed no adrenaline. To the world, a tragedy had just occurred. To Laurie, it was merely the conclusion of a successful experiment in friction. She turned back into the warmth of the penthouse, her movements shifting into a fluid, practiced sequence. This was the liturgy of erasure, the silent work that ensured the husband-collector remained a ghost in a lace cap. She did not rush. Haste was the hallmark of the guilty, and Laurie was a professional. She walked to the bar, her black-featured gloves ensuring no trace of her presence remained on the crystal. She picked up the decanter of aged Scotch Julian had been enjoying moments before his life tilted. With a methodical hand, she emptied the remaining amber liquid into the sink, watching it swirl down the drain, a liquid ghost of his final vanity. She washed the glass with scalding water, drying it to a high shine before placing it back on the shelf in its exact, original position. Every surface Julian had touched in his final hour was wiped clean of his presence, not out of malice, but to reset the stage for the performance that was about to begin. Moving back to the balcony, she used a specialized solvent-soaked cloth to wipe the invisible, slick residue from the marble tracks and the railing. She worked with the focus of an artisan, ensuring the stone returned to its natural state. When she was finished, the balcony looked as it always had, expensive, pristine, and deceptively safe. She took the used cloth and tucked it into a hidden pocket beneath her petticoats, a small weight of evidence that she would dispose of miles away from Boston. Next came the construction of the alibi. Laurie retreated to the master bathroom, a sprawling cathedral of white marble and gold fixtures. She turned the shower to its highest temperature, letting the room fill with a thick, cloying fog of steam. She draped a few used towels over the rack and scattered a light dusting of scented powder near the sink, creating the sensory profile of a maid deep in her evening chores. This was the architecture of the unseen. If she was surrounded by the humid evidence of work, no one could fathom she had been standing in the cold air of the balcony watching a man die. She stepped toward the mirror, watching as the steam began to blur her reflection. This was the most critical part of the erasure, the transition of her soul. She let her shoulders slump, her posture losing its predatory sharpness. She practiced the widening of her eyes until they appeared glassy with shock, and bit her lower lip until it flushed a bruised, delicate red. She was no longer the architect of a fall. She was Laurie, the simple girl from the agency, terrified and overwhelmed by a world she didn't understand. A distant, low-frequency wail began to rise from the streets below, the first siren. The city was finally responding to the broken body on the pavement. Laurie didn't flinch. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing her lungs to mimic the hyperventilation of a panic attack. She mussed a few strands of her dark hair, letting them fall over her forehead in a way that suggested a frantic search for her employer. By the time the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse were breached by the first responders, Laurie was a masterpiece of grief. She was found huddled in the hallway near the guest wing, clutching a silver polishing cloth to her chest like a prayer book. Her face was pale, her voice a fractured whisper that seemed to crumble under the weight of the air. When the officers asked her where Mr. Vane was, she simply pointed a trembling finger toward the open balcony doors, her eyes filling with tears that were as beautiful as they were hollow. The transformation was complete. The killer had vanished, leaving only a witness so innocent-looking that the police felt the need to apologize for even asking her name. In the steam-filled bathroom and the polished bar, the truth had been scrubbed away, leaving only the narrative Laurie had written for them. The collection had officially begun, and the first entry was a triumph of timing and total erasure. Detective Leo Vance stepped onto the 84th floor of Blackwood Tower, the sharp, metallic scent of the Atlantic gale still clinging to the yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the doorway. While the forensic team swarmed the balcony like carrion birds under the harsh glare of portable work lights, Vance stood in the center of the living room, his hands deep in his pockets and his eyes tracing the silent, expensive geometry of the penthouse. He was a man who lived in the friction of life, a veteran of the Boston PD who had spent 2 decades deciphering the language of violence, and here, everything felt unnervingly smooth. To the technicians and the first responders, it was a textbook case of a wealthy man, a high balcony, and a low center of gravity. A tragic accident fueled by top-shelf scotch and poor footing on a rain-slicked night. But Vance noticed the too-perfect nature of the room. The air was heavy with the sterile scent of a fresh cleaning that seemed to have happened just moments after the soul had left the building. There were no discarded papers, no misplaced coasters, and no sign of the frantic energy that usually preceded a sudden death. The apartment felt less like a home and more like a curated museum of a life that had already been archived. He walked toward the kitchen, his heavy boots thudding softly on the hardwood, and stopped when he saw her. She was sitting at the white quartz island, draped in a gray police blanket that made her look like a fallen bird amidst the vast, cold luxury of her employer's estate. Her beauty was inestimable, a porcelain perfection that radiated a childlike innocence and a calm, seductive stillness that seemed to draw the light of the room toward her. Even under the harsh, unflattering fluorescent lights of the kitchen, she looked entirely incapable of a murderous crime, her features soft and untroubled by the jagged edges of malice. The young officer beside her was already leaning in, his voice hushed and protective, his posture a defensive shield against the reality of the situation. He was clearly under her spell, his professional distance evaporated by the sheer magnetism of her vulnerability. To the officer, she was a victim of circumstance. To Vance, she was an anomaly in a black and white uniform. "Laurie, isn't it?" Vance asked, his voice low and devoid of the chivalry the other men were offering. He didn't sit down. He stood at the edge of her peripheral vision, watching for the tiny, subconscious tells that the body gives off when the mind is constructing a narrative. She looked up, her lower lip trembling just enough to invite pity, her large, dark eyes brimming with unshed tears that caught the light like glass. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that sounded as if it might snap if the room got too loud. I was just doing the chores. I was in the back suite, steaming the master bathroom. I didn't see anything. I only heard the wind howling through the glass. It sounded like the building was crying." She was a masterpiece of vulnerability, her fingers clutching a white polishing cloth to her chest like a prayer book. As she spoke, her movements were so graceful and her gaze so clear that every man in the room seemed to subconsciously move to protect her. She told a story of a diligent worker lost in her duties, a girl who had been hired only 3 weeks ago to bring order to Julian Vane's chaotic, high-powered life. She spoke of his kindness, his preference for quiet evenings, and his habit of standing on the balcony to watch the harbor. Every word was a brick in a wall of innocence, constructed with a precision that was almost too poetic for the trauma she claimed to have witnessed. Vance watched the way she tucked a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear, noting how her innocent appearance acted as a hypnotic veil over his team. It was the halo effect in its most dangerous form, the human tendency to believe that something beautiful must also be good. Yet as Vance looked at the spotless counters and the pristine glass of the balcony doors, a tiny seed of doubt took root in the back of his mind. The scene wasn't just clean, it was sanitized. He moved to the balcony, kneeling to inspect the marble threshold. There was a faint, lingering slickness there, something that didn't feel like the natural condensation of a Boston fog. He looked back at Laurie through the glass. She was watching him, her face a mask of sorrow, but for a split second, he thought he saw a flicker of something else, a cold, clinical observation that vanished as soon as he made eye contact. She shifted her gaze back to her tea, the perfect image of a shattered domestic. "You're very thorough in your work, Laurie," Vance said, stepping back inside and looming over the counter. "The apartment is immaculate. Not many people could keep a place this large so controlled." "Mr. Vane liked things a certain way," she replied softly, her voice steadying. "I just wanted to please him. I didn't want him to be unhappy." Vance nodded, his eyes lingering on her gloved hands. She hadn't taken them off, claiming the shock had made her forget. It was a small detail, but in Vance's world, the small details were the only things that stayed honest. He looked at the young officer, who was now glaring at Vance for his perceived coldness toward the girl. The architecture of her lie was flawless, supported by the instincts of every man in the room who wanted to be her hero. Vance felt the distinct, chilling sensation that he was being invited into a trap disguised as a tragedy. He turned away, his mind already beginning to pull at the loose threads of her story, knowing that while gravity had claimed Julian Vane, something far more calculated had set the clock. He left her there, a doll among the ruins, sensing that this was not the end of a story, but the opening movement of a very long, very bloody symphony. The departure of Julian Vane's body was a silent, clinical affair, the heavy gurney wheels muffled by the thick hallway carpets as the elevator descended toward the waiting ambulance and the inevitable cold of the morgue. In the wake of the sirens and the frantic energy of the first responders, the penthouse had settled into a heavy, artificial stillness that Detective Leo Vance found more unsettling than the most chaotic of crime scenes. He retreated to his makeshift command center in the building's security office, a cramped room where the blue glow of a dozen monitors cast long, distorted shadows across his weary, lined face. He began the grim, digital archaeology of a preliminary background check, his fingers dancing over the keys with a restless energy as he dug into the life of the girl who had survived the night. On paper, the maid was a ghost of absolute perfection. Her employment history, documented through a high-end Manhattan domestic agency, was impeccable, showing 3 years of quiet, efficient service for families who had nothing but glowing praise for her discretion, her skill, and her childlike devotion to her duties. Yet, as Vance scrolled through the encrypted digital files, he felt a familiar, nagging prickle of unease at the base of his skull. The references were all from people who were no longer reachable. They had either moved abroad shortly after her term of employment ended, or had passed away from natural causes in their twilight years, leaving no one to verify the girl beyond the sterile text of an old email. The papers were technically flawless, authenticated by every necessary stamp and signature, but they felt hollow, like a beautifully bound book that contained nothing but blank, silent pages. Every lead he followed led to a polite dead end, a trail of expensive ink that left no scent for him to track. He stared at her digital portrait, the same innocent face that had disarmed his team upstairs, and realized that he wasn't looking at a person so much as a carefully constructed void. Across town, in the sterile, high-end luxury of a department-arranged hotel room, the woman the world knew as Laurie was engaged in a different kind of archaeology. She stood before the heavy mahogany vanity mirror, her porcelain face illuminated by the soft, amber glow of a bedside lamp that made her eyes shimmer with a deceptive warmth. With a steady, unhurried hand, she reached up and unpinned the white lace maid's cap, setting it on the polished glass tabletop with the same clinical detachment a soldier might use to set down a helmet after a long campaign. The Laurie persona, the wide-eyed, grieving witness with the trembling lower lip and the soft, fractured voice, was discarded as easily as a worn garment. She reached into her travel bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with the meticulous, handwritten details of her collections across the continent. She crossed out Julian Vane's name with a single, elegant line of black ink. The Boston chapter was closed, and the debt he didn't know he owed had been settled in full. She moved to the closet, where her modest domestic uniform was already being replaced by a wardrobe of an entirely different character and class. She folded the black-and-white fabric with a ritualistic, almost religious precision, tucking it away into the bottom of her suitcase as if it were a costume for a play that had just ended its successful run. Out came a series of soft, muted cashmeres and structured silks in shades of slate gray and deep navy, the attire of a refined, educated young woman moving toward the inner circles of Newport's old money society. As she packed, she checked a hidden, velvet-lined compartment in the lid of her suitcase. Inside was a small, heavy pouch. She opened it, allowing a single, massive gold signet ring to spill into her palm, Julian's ring, taken from his dressing room in the frantic, uncoordinated confusion following his fall. It was her first trophy of the series, a weight of solid gold that proved her timing had been as flawless as her alibi. She felt the cold metal against her skin and smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that would have terrified the officers currently hailing her as a victim. While Vance stared at a blinking cursor in the basement of the Blackwood Tower, wondering why a girl with such a perfect past felt so much like a phantom, the woman in the hotel room was already looking south toward the rocky shores of Rhode Island. She wasn't running from the law. She was simply moving to the next stage of her grand design. She caught her reflection one last time, not as Lori the maid, but as a hunter who knew that the most dangerous weapon in the modern world was a face that invited no suspicion and a heart that felt no heat. She turned off the lamp, leaving the room in a thick, total darkness that matched the hollow heart of her impeccable paper trail. By morning, Lori would be nothing more than a name in a dusty police file, and the collector would be halfway to the Gilded Age mansions of Newport, where another husband was waiting to be found. The game was expanding, and as the city of Boston slept, the trail of the maid was already being washed away by the tide of her next ambition. Lori has left Boston with her first trophy, but Detective Vance is already smelling the smoke of her lies. Will his intuition be enough to stop her before she reaches Newport? The finality of a gavel usually sounds like thunder, but in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Boston Medical Examiner's office, it sounded like the scratching of a fountain pen. The coroner's report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic brevity, death by blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from a significant height, manner of death, accidental. There were no traces of struggle in the victim's fingernails, no defensive wounds, and no foreign DNA found on the balcony beyond the standard domestic cleaning agents. For the city of Boston, the case of Julian Vane was closed, a tragic footnote in the annals of the wealthy and the reckless. But for Detective Leo Vance, the ink on that report felt like a personal insult, a cold shroud draped over a truth he could feel but could not prove. He stood in the precinct commander's office, the morning light cutting through the blinds like the bars of a cage, listening to a man who had already moved on to the next budget meeting. The order was absolute. The Vane file was to be shuttered. With no evidence of foul play and a pristine witness statement from the housemaid, there was no justification for a continued drain on department resources. Vance had argued until his voice was a ragged shadow, pointing to the hollow nature of the maid's background and the surgical precision of the crime scene's cleanliness. His commander had simply sighed, offering a patronizing pat on the shoulder and a reminder that, sometimes, Leo, a slip is just a slip. The frustration burned in Vance's gut, a low, simmering heat that refused to cool. He knew that somewhere in the city, the girl with the porcelain face was walking free, her innocence intact and her tracks washed away by the very system designed to catch her. He watched from his window as the coroner's van pulled away, carrying the last physical remains of a man who had been outsmarted by a ghost. While Vance was being silenced by red tape, the woman once known as Lori was navigating the echoing limestone halls of South Station. She moved through the morning commute with a rhythmic, quiet grace, her presence a soft blur against the frantic energy of the city. She was no longer wearing the black-and-white uniform of service. Instead, she was dressed in a tailored coat of dove-gray wool, her dark hair pulled back into a sophisticated knot. She looked like a young professional, perhaps a graduate student or a junior executive, the kind of woman people instinctively stepped aside for out of respect rather than class-based invisibility. She carried a single, high-end leather suitcase, her movements devoid of the frantic haste that usually accompanied a departure. She was not fleeing a crime, she was concluding a business trip. The train to Newport was boarding on track 5. Lori took her seat in the quiet car, leaning her forehead against the cool glass as the engine began to thrum with life. As the train pulled away from the platform, she watched the Boston skyline begin to recede, the Blackwood Tower standing like a jagged glass tooth against the gray Atlantic sky. She felt no remorse, no lingering shadow of the man she had watched tilt into the abyss. To her, Julian Vane had been a transaction, a necessary entry in a ledger that was far from finished. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, midnight blue velvet pouch. Her fingers moved over the fabric with a tactile hunger before she loosened the drawstring. She tipped the pouch into her palm, and the heavy gold signet ring of Julian Vane tumbled out. It was a massive piece of jewelry, encrusted with a deep red garnet and engraved with a family crest that dated back generations. In the shifting light of the moving train, the gold glowed with a dull, predatory warmth. This was her first trophy, a physical piece of the life she had just extinguished, a souvenir of her own perfection. She ran her thumb over the engraving, feeling the sharp edges of the crest. It was more than just gold. It was a testament to her timing and her ability to manipulate the gravity of a man's own ego. She held it for a long moment, allowing herself the briefest spark of pride, before slipping it back into the pouch and hiding it in a secret lining of her bag. The Boston collection was officially catalogued. As the train gathered speed, carving through the industrial outskirts of the city toward the rocky shores of Rhode Island, Lori reached into her handbag and pulled out a neatly folded news clipping. It was an article from a high society gazette, featuring a photograph of a sprawling, Gilded Age mansion in Newport. Standing in front of the ornate iron gates was a man in his late 50s, a wealthy widower, a maritime magnate known for his isolation and his recent search for a discreet and refined domestic manager to oversee his estate. Lori looked at his face, her eyes narrowing with a clinical, predatory focus. He looked lonely, a man built of old money and new grief, the perfect environment for a girl with an innocent face and a silent step. She smoothed the paper with her gloved hand, a faint, chilling smile playing at the corners of her lips. The hunt was already resetting, the geography of her spree expanding. While Detective Vance sat in a silent office in Boston, staring at a closed file and a haunting memory of a girl he couldn't catch, the collector was already halfway to her next prize. The train rattled over the tracks, a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to pulse with the word, next. She tucked the clipping away, closed her eyes, and let the motion of the journey lull her into a calm, dreamless sleep. Behind her, the city was a fading memory. Ahead of her, the gilded cages of Newport were waiting to be opened. The first episode of her masterpiece had ended, but the series was only just beginning to bleed. In the next episode, to feed the roots of a family tree, Evelyn enters the world of Newport maritime old money. How far do you think she can go before her innocence finally cracks? Don't let the trail grow cold. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell to witness episode 2, where the secrets are as deep as the ocean and the next accident is already being planned. You won't want to miss the moment the hunter becomes the hunted.